The first time I realized Karen had lost her mind was when I came home to the sound of wet cement sloshing against steel. Imagine pulling into your own driveway and seeing a 40-something woman in designer heels, hair sprayed to the point of helmet status, standing over a cement truck like she was orchestrating the construction of the Hoover Dam. Only she wasn't building anything. She was dumping fresh concrete directly over the hinges of my gate. My gate. The one I had welded myself after months of HOA harassment about aesthetic compliance. The sight was so absurd that for a solid 10 seconds, I thought I was hallucinating. Karen didn't notice me at first. She was too busy shouting instructions at the workers, who looked uncomfortable enough to belong on a hostage tape. More. Seal it in, I don't want that gate opening again, she barked, arms folded across her expensive blouse. Her tone carried the same authority as a mall cop on a Segway, loud but hollow. I killed the engine and just watched, leaning on my steering wheel, marveling at the gall it took to commandeer a cement truck for personal vendettas. Then she turned. And the instant she saw me, her face morphed into that smug smirk she must have practiced in the mirror. "Oh, you're home," she said, as though I'd just interrupted her from baking cookies instead of vandalizing my property. "You're pouring cement on my gate," I said flatly. She raised a manicured finger and wagged it like I was a child who'd left Legos on the floor. "Correction. I'm fixing a community safety issue. That gate of yours is a hazard. Non-compliant. The HOA has ruled, and I'm simply making sure you follow through." Her logic was so twisted it could have been used as a phone cord. I stared at the concrete, already hardening around the hinges, and then back at her. She didn't flinch. She thought she had already won. What she didn't know was that I never play checkers when someone insists on a chess match. See, the HOA had been circling me like vultures ever since I bought the old ranch-style property at the edge of the subdivision. My gate wasn't ornamental enough. My hedges weren't sculpted into geometric compliance. My mailbox leaned at a disrespectful angle. Every week, another notice in my mailbox. Karen was the queen bee behind all of it. She thrived on dominance, needing every neighbor to bend beneath her vision of perfection. But where others caved, I didn't. And that made me a target. Today, she'd escalated to industrial sabotage. Fine. If she wanted war, I'd show her what a long game really looked like. The cement truck rumbled away after dumping its payload, leaving behind a hardened gray tomb over my gate. Karen clapped her hands, satisfied, and strutted off toward her driveway, where her Bentley gleamed like a rolling ego. She tossed a final line over her shoulder. "Consider this the end of your little rebellion." Then she slid into that car like it was her throne and peeled off. I walked up to the gate, touched the fresh cement, and laughed under my breath. She thought she'd buried me. She had no idea she'd just set the stage to bury herself. Literally. I didn't touch the gate. I didn't try to fix it. That's the thing about cement. It remembers everything. Every footprint, every tire tread, every poor decision preserved forever. I grabbed my phone, snapped photos, and sent them straight to my lawyer with a 2-line message. HOA harassment. Property damage. Need advice. Then I sat back on my porch with a beer and waited. Because I knew Karen's arrogance was bottomless. She wouldn't just pour cement and call it a day. She'd circle back, gloat, maybe even escalate further. And that was my opening. People like her always bury themselves deeper. All I had to do was let her shovel. That night I couldn't sleep, not out of anger, but anticipation. I replayed the scene over and over, her smirk, her Bentley's exhaust fading down the street, the look on the workers' faces as they realized they'd probably just committed a felony on a bored housewife's orders. It was theater, and she was the unhinged lead actress. And tomorrow, when she strutted past my property, she'd expect to see defeat in my eyes. Instead, she'd find me smiling. Because I already had the perfect move lined up, and it didn't involve yelling, threats, or breaking the law. It involved patience, timing, and a Bentley that would never see daylight again. And that's how the first act of this absurd battle began. A gate entombed in cement, a Karen high on power, and me quietly sharpening the edges of a plan that would flip her entire game board upside down. She thought the cement ended my rebellion. She was about to learn it was the foundation of hers. I learned early that escalation plays out in slow, boring increments. People like Karen feed on spectacle, but they crumble under process. So I turned the neighborhood into a calendar and started marking dates. I spoke to neighbors who had been quietly eaten by HOA memos, and they gave me pieces of the story like stray puzzle parts. Petty fines, anonymous notes slipped under doors, the way Karen's face tightened when anyone questioned her. I met Luis, a retired county inspector who liked to fix things on his terms, and he listened without flinching. Luis had the kind of quiet gravity that makes municipal forms feel like weapons if you know how to wield them. We didn't rush. Legal momentum is a stealth weapon. I filed a formal complaint through the city portal and attached photos, timestamps, and sworn statements from 2 neighbors who'd had enough. The city assigned an inspector within 48 hours, which was the window I needed to shift the fight out of gossip and into paperwork. Karen reacted the way entitled people always do when their narrative is threatened. She became theatrically proactive, sending a neighborhood-wide email about public safety and hanging printed notices on lampposts about hazard. Her allies on the board praised her initiative. She was loud, visible, and predictably overconfident. Luis arrived the morning of the inspection in a county shirt and a clipboard that made him look official even when he was smiling. His presence reframed the issue. A private feud became a municipal matter, and that mattered because rules, blunt and dull as they often are, have teeth. A small crowd gathered. Neighbors peering through curtains, a kid balancing on a bike, the woman 2 doors down who always hoarded her folding chair for neighborhood spectacles. Karen came in a blazer that announced she'd staged this scene in her head long before she stepped onto the sidewalk. She expected witness, applause, a neat coronation. The inspector measured, photographed, and scribbled notes with a patience that felt surgical. He asked about permits and the sequence of events, and took exact readings of the area the cement covered. It wasn't dramatic. It was the opposite of drama, the steady accumulation of facts. The notice he left said, plainly, that the obstruction needed remediation to comply with emergency access code. That tiny sheet of paper reframed everything. The cement was no longer a trophy, it was a code violation requiring corrective action. Karen shifted gears to damage control, offering timelines, contractors, and a narrative about her benevolent supervision. She wanted to convert culpability into stewardship. That's when the plan moved from paperwork into practical logistics. I called Dan, the landscaper who has a pickup and an aversion to authoritarian neighbors. He recruited a few reliable guys who knew how to look like an official crew without making a scene. I also contacted a tow operator I'd met at a community fair and told him there might be a temporary need to reposition cars so repairs could proceed safely. Luis agreed to act as the official face of the operation. His county ID buys a lot of deference. The idea wasn't cleverness so much as leverage. Assemble legitimacy, then let procedure do the heavy lifting. Early the next morning Karen arrived in her Bentley, polished and beaming as if her presence alone were proof of propriety. She parked where she could be seen and then staked a claim to the narrative by lecturing anyone who would listen about safety and neighborly duty. She moved through the tidy choreography of someone used to being the lead actor in a small-town drama. The crew started chipping around the cement, careful and methodical, while Luis measured and took note. A crowd formed, and murmurs replaced the earlier idle curiosity. Then the first surprise. Dan's foreman uncovered a cracked municipal access rod beneath the pour, an exposed piece of infrastructure that the cement had concealed and likely stressed. A slow, unseen leak had begun under the slab. The discovery flipped the scene from petty to plausible danger, and the inspector's face tightened in the way of someone cataloging risk. Karen, who had been delivering her little sermon about community stewardship, suddenly sounded less composed. She tried to fracture the focus with indignation, accusing us of theatrics, of manufacturing problems. But the inspector recommended caution and suggested that vehicles be moved to give crews safe room to work and to prevent exacerbating the leak. Her reaction was telling. She refused at first to move the Bentley, posture rigid, insisting the car be allowed to remain so she could be seen as unbowed. She wanted spectacle, and spectacle often means refusing to take the practical step that would deflate your performance. Neighbors, who had quietly suffered her petty reign for years, watched as her stubborn theatricality began to look like vanity rather than principle. The tow operator, professional and calm, explained the safety implications and volunteered to temporarily relocate the vehicle to a safe perimeter, just until the repair was handled. She refused, and refusal has a weight that bends the wills of onlookers only so far. Then the second surprise happened, the one that accelerated things without anyone intending to manufacture harm. Karen, determined to demonstrate control, eased the Bentley forward herself to position it out of what she claimed was the line of work. The car rolled with that expensive, deliberate grace these vehicles have, and for a heartbeat she smiled as if victory were certain. But the ground under the edge of the exposed slab had been undermined by the leak. The front wheel sank a fraction into a soft pocket no one had expected. The car didn't crash. It simply settled, an affluent animal accidentally caught in an unanticipated rut. The moment reframed the street. People who had once nodded at Karen's pronouncements were quietly amused now, not with malice but with the relief of watching arrogance meet gravity. The tow operator eased the Bentley free without drama, and an embarrassed Karen snapped orders about liability and compensation while the inspector wrote his notes like a careful chronicler. She tried to spin the episode into evidence of harassment, accusers who had orchestrated a trap, but the inspector's photos, time-stamped and clinical, told a cleaner story. Unauthorized cement, an exposed municipal access point, and the clear sequence of events leading to an unplanned vehicle repositioning for safety. She filed counterclaims later that day, precise and furious, submitting a formal complaint to the HOA asserting harassment and conspiracy. That kind of paperwork reads like a practice performance, and she leaned into it with relish. But the city records already contained a different narrative. The inspector's notice, witness statements from neighbors, and a small, embarrassing ledger of choices that looked less like civic leadership and more like vanity paired with poor judgment. Small shifts of documentation rarely look like victory, but they compound. By dusk the gate was documented for remediation, the leak was scheduled for professional repair, and the immediate hazard had been contained. Karen sat in her driveway polishing legal arguments and preening for the next meeting, while neighbors dispersed with the slight smugness of people who've watched an overplayed hand fold. Her Bentley, momentarily humbled, glinted like a promise of retribution. I closed my eyes, counted patient victories, and slept knowing the next move would be inevitable and without frenzied haste. The funny thing about escalation is that once it starts, you can't shove it back in the box. After the city inspector left and Karen's Bentley had been humiliated by a soft patch of leaking soil, I figured she'd retreat. Maybe lick her wounds, regroup, find some new way to bother me that didn't involve cement mixers. But Karen didn't operate on retreat. To her, every setback was just an excuse to double the theatrics. And when a woman like that doubles down, the whole neighborhood ends up as her captive audience. I didn't have to wait long for Act 3 of her circus. The very next day, a fresh HOA notice arrived in my mailbox, only this time it wasn't a fine for non-compliant landscaping or gate design. No, Karen had drafted a sweeping emergency community safety ordinance, declaring all exterior gates in the neighborhood must be ornamental, accessible, and free of hazardous obstructions. Translation: she was rewriting the rules mid-game to make her cement stunt retroactively legal. She even had the audacity to sign it with a flourish, as though the HOA were her personal monarchy. The neighbors were growing restless. I could see it in their eyes as I walked my property. They were used to tolerating her power plays, but something about the Bentley getting stuck had cracked the facade. You could only watch a queen stumble in public so many times before you realized she wasn't wearing a crown at all. Still, no one dared confront her directly. That was left to me, the unwilling protagonist in her little saga. Instead of confronting her, I leaned into silence. Silence is underrated. It unnerves the loud, the dramatic, the perpetually self-important. Karen wanted my outrage, my yelling, some desperate attempt to chip away the cement and prove her right. What she got was me sitting on my porch in a lawn chair, sipping coffee, and watching the world pass by. That silence unsettled her more than anything, so she manufactured her next spectacle. 3 days later, she rolled out her Bentley with a trailer hitch, an accessory I'm convinced she didn't know how to use until she demanded some poor valet explain it to her. Behind the Bentley was a rented industrial compressor, the kind used for jackhammers. She parked in front of my cemented gate, uncoiled the hose, and waved at me like a queen delivering justice to a peasant. "Since you clearly can't handle your own property," she shouted, "I'm fixing this eyesore for you." Now, a rational person might have thanked her for undoing her own sabotage. But rationality had left the chat the moment she paid for a cement truck to vandalize my gate. I didn't move. I didn't stop her. I just pulled out my phone and started filming. She hated that. The jackhammer roared to life, rattling against the cement shell, echoing across the subdivision like a drumline. Within minutes, she'd chipped enough away to expose the bent hinges beneath. She stepped back, wiping sweat dramatically, clearly expecting applause from the gathering neighbors. That's when the compressor sputtered. A hose popped, and with one final violent shake, the jackhammer tipped sideways, gouging into the asphalt of the public street. Sparks flew, followed by an ugly grinding noise that set every dog in a 3-block radius barking. The crowd gasped. Karen spun toward me, face flushed, shouting about sabotage and tampered equipment. But the camera doesn't lie. It caught everything. Her reckless posturing, her refusal to hire licensed workers, her Bentley tethered like a show pony to equipment she had no business touching. Later, when the city reviewed the footage, they noted not only the property damage but also the liability hazard of an untrained civilian operating industrial machinery in a residential zone. The best part? Her overblown sense of control led her right into her next mistake. In the middle of the chaos, she left the Bentley idling with the trailer still hitched. When she stomped off to call someone, likely her lawyer or the HOA board, the compressor slowly shifted, rolling forward under its own weight. The trailer tongue jack wasn't locked. Gravity did the rest. The Bentley groaned, tilted, and in one gloriously karmic moment, the machine dented its pristine bumper. The sound was exquisite. Not a crash, more of a crunch like biting into an apple, but loud enough to echo through the watching crowd. Neighbors covered their mouth. A kid on a bike whispered, "Oh my God," like he'd just watched a superhero fall off a roof. And me? I stayed perfectly still, filming, calm as ever. Karen's scream when she saw the damage could have won an Oscar. She accused me, the neighbors, the inspector, anyone within shouting distance of conspiring against her. She threatened lawsuits, prison sentences, and divine retribution. But underneath the tantrum was panic, because for the first time her precious Bentley bore a scar she couldn't cover with a fresh coat of wax. Later that night, when the HOA board gathered in their sterile clubhouse to discuss her ordinance, I strolled in with a USB drive. I played the footage on the big screen, every second from her jackhammer debut to the compressor crunch. Silence filled the room. Even her allies couldn't spin it. What could they say? That I had tricked her into renting industrial equipment and attaching it to her own car? That I'd conspired with physics to create a slope? The vote to rescind her ordinance was unanimous. For once, her voice didn't carry. And I walked out knowing the balance had shifted. Not completely, not yet, but enough to see the cracks forming in her kingdom. Back at home, I leaned on the porch railing, looking at my cemented gate in the dim light. The slab was chipped now, fractured from her amateur jackhammering. The hinges bent, the frame mangled. It was a wreck, but a useful wreck. Because I knew the city would eventually force her to pay for its proper removal, along with the street repairs and the compressor mishap. And that would cost more than fines or memos ever could. But the real prize wasn't money. It was patience. Karen was unraveling in public, and unraveling people make mistakes. She'd already cracked her Bentley's perfect image. What she didn't know was that the stage she was building would soon demand a finale. And when the curtain finally fell, she wouldn't be the one writing the script. Karen's downfall didn't come all at once. It came in pieces like the cement she'd poured, solid at first, but prone to cracking under pressure. By the time Chapter 4 of this absurd saga rolled around, she wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting the weight of her own image, and the neighborhood was starting to see it. The HOA board, once her loyal echo chamber, was fractured. A few members still parroted her phrases about community standards and neighborhood prestige, but you could see it in their eyes. They were tired. Tired of defending the indefensible. Tired of watching their queen manufacture chaos out of nothing. But Karen didn't read the room. She doubled down, as she always did, and in doubling down, she set in motion the next domino. It started with the street repairs. The city sent a letter itemizing the damages from her jackhammer stunt. Asphalt gouged, public access rods compromised, and the need for licensed workers to tear out the cement slab she'd orchestrated. The estimated cost? North of $15,000. Karen treated the letter like a joke. She laughed, called it government extortion, and announced in a neighborhood email that she would not be paying a dime. If anyone thinks I will be bullied into submission, she wrote, they have underestimated my resolve. The problem was, the city wasn't bluffing. They filed a lien notice within 2 weeks, attaching the fine to her property. Her house, the one with the overpriced fountain and imported tiles, now had a legal blemish. That's when whispers started floating through the subdivision. Not just about her arrogance, but about her finances. Whispers that maybe Karen wasn't as untouchable as she pretended to be. I stayed quiet, still playing the long game. My gate remained a mangled monument, cement cracked, hinges bent. I didn't rush to fix it. I let it sit there, a gray scar that reminded everyone what she'd done. And every day she drove past in that Bentley, she had to see her handiwork mocking her. That was better than any lawsuit. But she couldn't stand silence. She needed to control the narrative. So she planned her biggest spectacle yet, a community restoration day. The flyers showed up on every doorstep, featuring her smiling face alongside promises of free food, music, and a demonstration of civic pride. Translation: Karen was going to hold a block party in front of my ruined gate to spin her vandalism into some twisted story about neighborhood improvement. The morning of the event, tents popped up along the street. A bounce house inflated across from my property, kids running wild while parents hovered with folding chairs. Food trucks parked along the curb, their sizzling grills filling the air with the smell of tacos and funnel cake. At first glance, it looked festive. But under the surface, tension simmered. People weren't here for the fun. They were here to see what fresh disaster Karen had conjured. She didn't disappoint. Around noon, she marched to center stage, microphone in hand, dressed like she was campaigning for office. Behind her, the cracked cement slab stood like a prop. She launched into a speech about preserving property values, defending standards, and safeguarding the integrity of our neighborhood. She painted herself as a martyr, a lone warrior battling the forces of chaos, meaning me. And then she delivered her grand flourish. She gestured to her Bentley, parked once again in dramatic fashion right in front of the gate. This car, she declared, is a symbol of what this community stands for. Order, excellence, prestige. That's when fate intervened. Or maybe it wasn't fate, maybe it was the universe rewarding patience. The food truck closest to her had parked on a slight slope. Its generator hummed, cables stretching across the pavement. A teenager on a bike swerved to avoid a toddler near the bounce house, clipped the cable, and yanked it loose. Sparks flew, the generator coughed, and the food truck's brakes, apparently not properly set, released with a metallic snap. The truck began to roll. Slow at first, then gathering momentum, it lumbered straight down the slope, straight toward Karen's Bentley. The crowd gasped. Karen turned just in time to see her symbol of prestige meet 2 tons of rogue steel and fried chicken. The sound was catastrophic. A crunch of metal, a shatter of glass, the kind of noise that silences even screaming children. The truck didn't total the Bentley, but it crushed the passenger side, tore through the mirror, and caved the door. It was no longer a luxury vehicle. It was a mangled husk with a hood ornament. For once, Karen was speechless. She stood frozen, microphone dangling at her side, as neighbors rushed forward, not to help her, but to check on the food truck driver and the panicked teenager who'd clipped the cable. The Bentley, once her throne, now looked like a battlefield casualty. I didn't move. I just leaned against my porch railing, arms crossed, and let the scene unfold. Because I knew this wasn't an accident in Karen's story, it was a narrative collapse. Every speech she'd ever given about order and prestige had just been demolished in front of the entire community. The fallout was immediate. People whispered. Phones recorded. The HOA president, who'd been clinging to Karen's coattails, quietly slipped away. Parents ushered their kids out of the bounce house, muttering about enough drama for one day. And Karen, trembling, tried to seize control of the microphone again. She stammered something about negligence, about sabotage, about how someone must have engineered this. But her voice cracked, and no one listened. Later that night, the video surfaced online. A neighbor had posted it to a local Facebook group with the caption, "When karma arrives at 20 miles per hour." Within hours it had hundreds of shares. The comments section was merciless. People called it poetic justice, divine comedy, even cinematic. And though no one tagged me directly, I knew the neighborhood understood. Karen had buried herself deeper than any cement truck ever could. The city added the damages to her growing lien. The food truck owner filed an insurance claim, but their adjuster took one look at Karen's history and flagged her for liability review. Suddenly, her prestige wasn't just dented, it was drowning under paperwork, bills, and public humiliation. I went to bed that night with the sound of crickets and the faint satisfaction of inevitability. Karen wanted to turn my gate into her stage. Instead, she turned her Bentley into a prop in the kind of slapstick comedy no one forget. And I knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because people like Karen don't stop when they're beaten. They stop when they're buried. And the cement she poured was still waiting to claim one final piece of her pride. By the time the 5th act of this ridiculous feud arrived, Karen was no longer just my problem. She was the neighborhood's entertainment, the HOA's liability, and the city's cautionary tale. Her Bentley sat in her driveway like a monument to hubris, half mangled, tarps taped across the shattered windows, the kind of sight that made passers-by slow down and whisper. But even in defeat, Karen had a way of convincing herself she was one move away from total victory. That was her fatal flaw, the belief that she could always outtalk reality. She avoided me after the Community Restoration Day disaster. Not a single snide comment, no glares, no fresh memos stuffed into my mailbox. For 2 whole weeks, she vanished into the shadows of her stucco palace. Neighbors speculated. Some said she'd left town, others whispered she was lawyering up. Personally, I didn't care. My gate was still cemented into a gray, fractured block, and every time I looked at it, I smiled. It was her calling card, left on my property like a signature she couldn't erase. But silence doesn't last with someone like Karen. One Friday morning, I woke to the rumble of engines and the high-pitched whine of machinery. I stepped outside to see a fresh cement truck idling in front of my property, again. Only this time, Karen wasn't orchestrating. She was panicking. Turns out, the city had finally issued its enforcement order. Remove the unauthorized cement slab, repair the access rods beneath, and restore the public street at her own expense. Crews of licensed workers, actual professionals, arrived with jackhammers, wheelbarrows, and rebar cutters. And who was footing the bill? Karen. The lien was being executed, and every dollar was coming out of her pocket. She stood there, pacing in her designer shoes, trying to spin the moment into something noble. "I'm leading the restoration effort," she announced to no one in particular. "This is about community pride." But no one believed her. Not after the videos, not after the speeches, not after the food truck turned her Bentley into a cautionary meme. The workers ignored her, chipping away at the slab she'd once ordered poured like a queen commissioning a fortress. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, enjoying the irony. She'd started this war by burying my gate in cement. Now she was paying thousands to dig it out. Every blow of the jackhammer was a drumbeat of poetic justice. And yet, fate wasn't done with her. Around noon, the foreman waved to a truck idling down the street, the flatbed that would haul away the broken chunks of concrete. The driver reversed into position, careful, slow. But here's the thing about narrow suburban streets: there isn't much room for error. And when Karen, in her usual need to be seen, parked the Bentley directly beside the work zone, error became inevitable. The flatbed's ramp lowered, its hydraulics hissing. Workers loaded the first chunks of Karen's cement into the truck bed, heavy slabs clattering like tombstones. The ground vibrated with each drop. Karen, ever the showwoman, strutted closer, shouting at the workers to be careful around her property. She gestured dramatically toward her Bentley, as if the mere mention of it could protect it from the laws of physics. Then came the moment no screenwriter could have staged better. A loader, hauling a particularly massive chunk of cement, tilted just a fraction too far. The slab slipped, not onto the street, not onto the loader, onto the Bentley. It landed with a sickening crunch, collapsing the roof in a single, brutal blow. Glass shattered. Metal warped. The hood buckled like a soda can under a boot. The Bentley didn't just dent this time, it was buried. Buried under the very cement Karen had once ordered dumped on my gate. The silence was deafening. Workers froze. Neighbors gasped. Someone's kid let out a whistle like they'd just seen a magic trick. And Karen? She screamed. Not the theatrical shriek she'd perfected for HOA meetings. This was primal, raw, the kind of sound that only escapes when pride collides head-on with reality. She collapsed to her knees, clawing at the slab, shouting at the workers to lift it, to fix it, to undo what was now irreversible. But the damage was done. Her Bentley, her pride, her symbol of prestige, had been transformed into a grave marker under a coffin of her own cement. I didn't laugh. Not openly. But inside, something cold and satisfied clicked into place. This was the ending I hadn't planned but couldn't have scripted better. She wanted to bury me in cement. Instead, she buried her own throne. The aftermath unfolded quickly. The city inspector, summoned by the foreman, documented everything. Since Karen had been legally responsible for both the slab and the removal, the incident was logged as an unintended consequence of compliance. Translation: her fault, her bill. Insurance wouldn't touch it. The lien expanded. And now, on top of street repairs and slab removal, she had to account for a luxury car totaled by her own arrogance. The neighborhood's sympathy evaporated. Even her staunchest supporters on the HOA board distanced themselves, muttering about bad optics and leadership fatigue. Within a month, she resigned her position under the guise of health reasons. In truth, she had become a pariah, the woman who'd tried to cement over a neighbor's gate and ended up cementing her own downfall. As for me, I finally got my gate restored. The city oversaw the repairs, paid for by Karen's mounting fines. A new steel frame replaced the old one, stronger, straighter, untouchable. I welded the hinges myself, savoring the irony of building something permanent on the rubble of her destruction. Neighbors stopped by to chat more often now. Some offered quiet thanks, Others shared stories of their own skirmishes with Karen's reign. We weren't suddenly best friends, but there was an unspoken camaraderie, the relief of knowing the queen had fallen, and the neighborhood no longer lived under her thumb. Karen still lived there, technically, but she was a ghost. Her driveway sat empty, the tarped Bentley eventually towed away, her once perfect lawn overgrown at the edges. She no longer strutted down the street, no longer held court at HOA meetings. If she passed by at all, she kept her head down, sunglasses hiding her eyes. And the neighbors, once intimidated, barely noticed her anymore. I never gloated. Not directly. I didn't need to. The cement did all the talking. Every time I walked through my new gate, I remembered the day she tried to bury me. And every time I looked across the street at the empty space where her Bentley once gleamed, I knew the universe had a sharper sense of humor than either of us ever could. That's the thing about people like Karen. They build their empires on control, on intimidation, on spectacle. But empires built on arrogance don't last. They crack. They crumble. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, they collapse under the very weight they tried to use against you. Karen poured cement over my gate. In the end, all she did was pour it over her own life. And I didn't lift a finger. I just watched, waited, and let gravity, paperwork, and karma do the rest.